In 1945, the United States was drowning in debt. Not a little debt, not manageable debt. The U.S. owed more money than at any point in its history. Over 120% of its entire economy. By every normal rule of finance, this country should have been weakened, constrained, forced to pull back. Instead, it walked out of World War II as the most powerful nation on Earth. That contradiction is the story, and the uncomfortable truth behind modern global power. Because the U.S. didn't become dominant despite its war debt. It became dominant because of how it used it. And that matters right now more than most people realize. After World War II, much of the world was physically broken, factories flattened, ports destroyed, currencies unstable, governments desperate. The United States was different. Its cities were untouched. Its factories had been running at full speed for years. Its workforce was trained, industrialized, and massive. But financially, the U.S. looked reckless. Washington had borrowed unimaginable sums to fight the war. Liberty ships, tanks, planes, wages, logistics, everything ran on borrowed money. The bill came due in 1945. And here's where the story gets strange. Instead of panicking about debt, American policymakers leaned into it. They understood something most countries at the time did not. Debt is only dangerous if you owe the wrong people in the wrong currency at the wrong moment. Let's slow this down. During World War II, the U.S. didn't borrow mostly from foreign countries. It borrowed from its own citizens, war bonds, teachers, factory workers, farmers, families. Americans loaned money to their own government, not because it was profitable, but because it felt necessary, patriotic even. So when the war ended, the U.S. owed money to itself. That alone changed the rules. But it gets more interesting. The U.S. government had another advantage, control over the global money system that was about to be born. In 1944, before the war even ended, Allied leaders met in a quiet hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. This wasn't a victory celebration. It was a planning session. They were designing the financial architecture of the post-war world, and the U.S. arrived with leverage no one else had. Most of the world's gold sat in American vaults. Most of the world's industrial capacity sat on American soil, and most countries urgently needed American goods. So the deal was simple but powerful. The US dollar would become the center of the global system. Other currencies would peg themselves to it, and the dollar would be pegged to gold. On paper, this sounded fair, stable, orderly. In reality, it gave the U.S. something extraordinary, the ability to borrow in its own currency, while the rest of the world needed that currency to function.
This is the hidden mechanism most people miss. When other countries borrowed, they risked currency collapse. When the U.S. borrowed, it printed the unit everyone else depended on. Now, let's talk about the debt itself. The U.S. didn't rush to pay it off. Instead, it quietly did something far more effective. It let time and growth do the work. As soldiers came home, factories retooled for civilian goods, cars, appliances, homes. The economy expanded rapidly, and inflation, moderate, controlled inflation, began to eat away at the real value of the debt. Same dollars, less weight. The numbers stayed big, but the burden shrank. This wasn't accidental. Low interest rates kept borrowing cheap. Strong growth raised tax revenue. And because the debt was mostly domestic, there was no foreign panic. Meanwhile, something else was happening. Europe needed money, fast. So the U.S. launched the Marshall Plan. On the surface, it looked like generosity, aid, rebuilding. But look closer. The dollars sent to Europe often came right back to the U.S., spent on American goods, machinery, and food. Europe rebuilt. American factories stayed busy, and the dollar spread everywhere. It was aid that doubled as market expansion. Quietly brilliant, slightly cynical, and very effective. By the early 1950s, the U.S. still carried massive debt, But relative to its booming economy, that debt no longer looked dangerous. More importantly, the world was now financially organized around American power. Trade priced in dollars, reserves held in dollars, loans issued in dollars. The U.S. didn't just win the war militarily, it won the accounting system. Here's the irony. The same debt that should have weakened the U.S. became the glue holding its influence together. Foreign governments needed American stability to protect their reserves, so American instability became everyone's problem. That's an unusual position in history, and it came with risks. By the late 1960s, cracks appeared. The U.S. printed more dollars than it had gold to back. Foreign countries noticed. In 1971, the U.S. quietly abandoned the gold standard altogether. No announcement to the public, no global vote, just a decision. And yet, the dollar remained dominant. Why? Because by then, the system was too big to abandon. Oil was priced in dollars, trade flowed in dollars, debt was written in dollars. The world had adjusted its habits. The U.S. had turned temporary war debt into permanent structural power. But here's the uncomfortable question. If debt helped create that power, what happens when debt grows without war, without rebuilding, without shared sacrifice? Today, U.S. debt is higher than it was after WW2 relative to the economy. But the conditions are different. The factories aren't expanding at the same pace. The global system is more competitive, and other countries are slowly testing alternatives. The post-war trick worked because of timing, scale, and trust. Trust that the U.S. would remain stable. Trust that the dollar would hold value. Trust that the system wouldn't be abused. Trust, once broken, is expensive to rebuild. After WW2, debt was transformed into influence, order, and control. The question now isn't whether debt can be powerful, it's whether the same move can ever be repeated, or whether it only works once in a century.